even understand what are all the obligations that exist on a single agreement. There's clearly lack lack of follow through on obligations, performance obligations and expectations that have been listed out in agreements across the board. And this problem doesn't necessarily reside with legal. Of course, legal touches pretty much every single contract, but then obligations could touch other departments like HR, like finance, IT departments for measurement of SLAs and so on. But there is no consistency. There is no centralized visibility, centralized ownership, and follow through of these obligations. And what happens as a result of that are there are inefficiencies that creep in when contract renew when it's time for contract renewals. No one has visibility into obligations. How did the vendor perform? How can I look at historical performance to now go and negotiate better terms with the vendor? Those things are not possible. I know I'm talking a lot, but I'd love to give our luminary legal expert, Jason Smith, who has joined us, to share some of his perspective around challenges related to obligations. Jason, over to
Thanks,
you.
thanks, Sunil. And
Yeah.
everything you're saying is correct. And what makes this really ironic, I think, is I've worked in contract management with contract management technology for, I guess, going on 15 years now, and even contract management beyond before that. And a lot of the focus tends to be on, at least from what I see, on the process of contracts from the time they're requested, drafting, negotiation, approvals through execution. There's a lot of time and a lot of money focused on fixing that piece of the puzzle. And granted, it's a tough piece because there are so many what we often refer to as warring factions, the different business units that have different needs and different requirements that are all feeding into this one process. But what I find so ironic is that as much as we spend on time and money on that piece of it, we're really focusing on the pre-execution process. And if you really think about a contract, like the bulk of the risk is created at moment of execution. There is no risk of that contract until you've actually got a contract, until you've got it fully executed. And yet we don't spend a whole lot of time on fixing that post execution process. And maybe it's because it's not as linear of a process that we necessarily think of as the pre-execution phase. But when we think about it, like a lot of the activity that's going on today are lookbacks, a lot of big look back projects. And I'll tell you right now, look back projects aren't cheap. And there's a lot of money being spent on companies that, I mean, World CC or the former IACCM always had a statistic. A lot of people repeated that, the average Fortune 2000 company had between 20 and 40,000 active contracts. I mean, that's a haystack. And when we start talking about looking for specific obligations, now you're talking about trying to find that needle in that haystack. And that's, to me, as ironic as how much focus is on the pre-execution piece of it and how little of it, at least to this point, has been on that post-execution obligation world. Like you said, it's obligations from a commercial side, from a legal side, from a risk management compliance side. And there's so much to be done. But when we look at it, and you look on this chart here, the graphic, it's time consuming. If somebody says, go back and look through a contract and pull out all of the obligations, that's time consuming. Now multiply that by 20 to 40,000 times. And that's just one person looking through those, through those contracts. And that's a lack of visibility. It feeds into the idea that, okay, we entered into these contracts. Now we have to perform. And we either have to make payments or we have to deliver something, provide something to the other side. If we don't have visibility into that, how do we run the business? How do we have any insight into it? And then what ends up happening is if you don't meet your obligations, you're just creating legal and compliance issues that you're going to have to then address, which then become expensive in and of itself. And then the third thing here, the lack of ownership, I think is really kind of bundled in all of that, that you've got
Yep.
so many players involved that, I mean, even just from the contract perspective, there's still a question as to, and the question differs by company, who owns the contract. And I don't know how many webinars I've done just on that topic. Legal, I'm a lawyer, so I look at it and go, well, legal should own the contracts, right? It's a legal document. But then sales comes in and says, well, there's a lot of commercial activity documented in that agreement, and the process itself shouldn't be a legal process. It's more of a commercial
Commercial. Yeah.
relationship project. So, you look at these things and you go, okay, who owns it? And that's sort of the first stumbling block to get to the other pieces, which is who owns it, what do they own, and how do we get to it?
Yeah. Jason, thank you. Thank you for that insight. I couldn't agree anymore. And you elaborated a lot on the heart of the problem, i.e., finding that needle, finding those obligations, and then there is yet this whole other mountain of work that has to be accomplished to make sure and validate whether those obligations were fulfilled or not. um, and these are obligations, like you said, these are obligations that you have to deliver upon, or these could be obligations that a counterparty is responsible for completing. And i.e., it's a management, it's a vendor management or a counterparty management issue that just gets magnified. And lack of visibility into the fulfillment of not just the obligation detection, but the fulfillment of the obligation, that can lead to poor vendor performance. It can lead to relationship deterioration as well. So yep, I'm just really mostly just echoing your comments.
Yeah, and I will say too, on the obligation side, a lot of times the obligations, the reason it becomes so unwieldy is because we really haven't managed them effectively in the past. So there's
Yeah.
sort of two things. One is the look back, and let's go back and find the obligations in all of the past contracts. Then the next phase is really, let's prepare for not having to look back on all the go forward contracts. And I think that's where technology really comes into play, because what we want to do is we want to set up a mechanism during that pre-execution process where we're so worried about creating a document and putting the right language in and putting the right information, is collecting the obligation information during that process so that it becomes more of a structured or a data, structured data on the back end, which then becomes much easier to manage and to report on. Maybe, for APIs into other systems that you have to touch in order for delivery, whether it's licensing systems or compliance systems, background checks, or other processes that have to kick off. If you can sort of create that structure before the contract is executed, that part of that regular contract lifecycle, it becomes easier on the front end, and you do it as you go, versus let's wait 10 years and then look back on every contract we've ever done and try to find all those pieces.
Yep. I'm getting so excited hearing you. You've not really seen what Avenir has to offer, but this is exactly what we do, and we'll come to that in a minute, i.e., really, really taking care of that look forward process upfront itself, along with the contract setup and execution of the agreement. We'll come to that. But yeah, I think we've talked a lot about contracts, and just like you said, risk doesn't kick in until until a contract is executed. And fundamentally, I'm not a legal expert, but fundamentally, the very reason one gets into a contract is to manage risk and to manage the counterparty. And the way that's managed is through all the obligations and deliverables and commitments that are listed on an agreement. Yep. With that, we can move on to the next slide. Let's move forward in this discussion. Okay. So yes, the topic of our webinar is really focused around SaaS contracts, and so we are basically now double clicking into SaaS agreements, and these agreements can take a variety of shapes and forms. These agreements could um, uh, uh, you know parties get into SaaS agreements for procurement of hardware, for procurement of software, support, data, security, and so on and so forth. And once again, yeah, we already talked about this. These types of agreements obviously touch many different departments, and in addition to the agreement itself, there are many other documents, addendums, references to regulatory requirements that go along with that agreement, like privacy policies and terms of services, and regulatory laws. In the case of healthcare, HIPAA requirements also creep into these types of SaaS agreements. So really, just the purpose of this is to level set, what we are talking about when we discuss, when we talk about SaaS agreements.
And Sunil, I think it's important to dive deep into this because SaaS agreements do get very complex. We're not just talking about here's a product, here's a widget, and we're going to sell you X number of units at X price, and
Yep.
now we have to deliver it, and you will pay for that. I mean, we start talking about SLAs related to uptime, disaster recovery, business continuity, transfer of IP rights, and
Yep.
the way that the SaaS model works is who owns what piece of that, which becomes critical later on down the road. You start talking about indemnity, limitations of liability, and like you said, you HIPAA, you got data protection, you got all these other facets, and it's not just legal and or sales that are having to kind of put this information in. You've got all these departments across an organization that not only give input into the contract, but then have the obligations, if you will, to manage these as this contract goes on month to month, year to year, versus just a once in time transaction.
Yep, absolutely, Jason. And actually, everything you talked about in terms of the different types of SLAs that exist, I think that's just coming up on our next slide. So if you can move on to the next slide. Um, Yep. Just once again, actually, even before we get to the types of SLAs and such, um, from our side, what we did is we really summarized, the complexities that we see in SaaS contracts. This is really, we summarized and simplified the complexities we see on SaaS contracts into 4 buckets. And we thought this would be a good time to actually take a poll from the audience and learn from them, which area do they see the greatest pain in. So, yep, Colin, over to you for the poll. Let's see who responds and what response do we get. Okay, I think folks are a bit shy. All right, we're getting there. Halfway through, we got half the participants have responded. Okay, let's look at the results. Oh. Colin, you want to share the results?
Yeah, can you see them?
Oh, yeah. If you scroll down, Sunil.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Where do you experience the greatest pain? Oh, wow. So the bulk of the audience has voted, at least the ones that did respond have voted SLAs as a primary area. And That's pretty interesting because SLAs are pretty much a specific form of obligations. But it's interesting that the second highest category where the audience experienced or reported that they experienced pain is in the area of renewals. And it's interesting because these two are tie in so tightly and closely to each other. I mean, basically, SLAs and performance against SLAs is almost always an input into the renewal process and the renewal negotiation. So, thank you everyone for sharing your input on where you are seeing the greatest pain and complexity. So we can move on now to talking a little bit more about SLAs specifically. And Jason, basically this slide is summary of what you actually already covered. You talked about, when we talked about complexities in SaaS contracts, we talked about the different departments, the different types of agreements, and the different types of or categories of procurement that exist with SaaS contracts. And then you called out some really important examples of SLAs that get embedded in those SaaS contracts. And here's our take at it at that list of SLAs. This is clearly not meant to be comprehensive, but uptime, the hidden fees. You talked about regulatory requirements. Those come into get outlined sometimes as SLAs. SLAs related to disaster recovery and system availability and so on. They're all over here. And yep, we'll be sharing this slide with the audience as well. And really, of course, you know your business business best. We're not trying to educate you here, but we just wanted to re-emphasize, the number of SLAs that need to be tracked, and then that really then gets translated into obligations, and it can definitely be a nightmare, like we've talked about, just um, keeping up with the SLAs or monitoring SLAs.
Yeah, and I think something interesting to note here, if you look at these, there's a lot of contractual obligations that are sort of dependent sometimes on even third parties. And, it makes it even more crucial to constantly monitor and manage these when your business and your relationship is impacted by, the other sort of uncertain areas, whether it be uncertainty in the economy, uncertainty in a pandemic, uncertainty in the supply chain. And so managing and monitoring key components of this, some of them are fully within your grasp, and maybe it's just time consuming to manage them, but a little bit easier to deal with. And then some are you've got reliances on other parties as well.
Yep. Thank you for that point. I mean, you're so right. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, contracts are not necessarily always. There are multiple parties always involved in agreements. Yeah. We can move on then. Well, it's almost time for another poll as well. It looks like that was fun, although I goofed up with the scrolling. But what we've done here at Avenir, and this is not rocket science. What we've done is we've developed a maturity model framework for obligation management. And of course, there's a lot of detail behind this. What we did is we're just representing this in a simplified manner out here. And the maturity model has multiple levels. The very basic level being whether an organization has a baseline contract repository to store all of its contracts and obligations, and then the levels keep increasing. Level 2 is really level 2 is really identification and tracking of obligations. However, that's done manually. Level 3 of this maturity framework uses advanced technologies. So it assesses organizations on the basis of the technology. For example, artificial whether an organization is using some form of intelligence to discover obligations and auto assign them to various parties. And then the highest level of maturity is that even after the identification of those obligations, how is the organization then taking that information and automating the actual monitoring and compliance against those obligations. Yep. So what we want to do now is actually take a poll, and with these 4 levels, we wanted to check with the audience where they are on the, where you think you are on the maturity scale as it relates to obligation management. Okay. So once again, level 1 was okay, I think you have that information. Level 1 was just the repository. Level 2 was tracking of obligations, but manually. Level 3 was using advanced technology like artificial intelligence to identify and discover obligations. And then finally, of course, taking that forward to the compliance monitoring in an automated manner. Okay. Or maybe we give the audience another 10, 15 seconds to vote. I'd love to see at least half the audience vote.
Come on, that means 2 more of y'all.
2 more. Come on.
It is interesting, though, to see the race that's happening right now. It's really between 2 categories.
Oh, I've not seen the results, but I will.
Yeah, if you scroll down, you can see them live. Yep. And it's not unsurprising. Or not surprising? Oh, no, it is unsurprising.
Yep.
There we go. Now you get 50%. And of course, they're exact.
Okay, so let's look at the results. Okay, so this is wow. Okay, so looks like the bulk of the pretty much everyone that responded indicated that there is really no automation in terms of obligation tracking, discovery, or monitoring those obligations. The good news is that, looks like the audience definitely, 50% of or everyone that responded does have a contract repository. So that is good. And, but again, it's interesting that, half the audience that responded that they have a contract repository also responded that pretty much also responded that they don't do any tracking of obligations. Right? Yeah. So okay, thank you for this. This is interesting, and so let's get into how intelligent solutions, and I don't wish to blow our own trumpet, so to speak, but how intelligent solutions like Avenir can help you manage contractual obligations, whether they're your own obligations or obligations that that the counterparty or your vendor is responsible for. Okay, we can move on to the next slide with that. So Avenir has a contract management solution. Like any other mature contract management solution, it does offer the end-to-end lifecycle automation of an agreement, all the way from request to drafting to redlining, negotiation, so on and so forth. In addition to that, Avenir's contract management solution offers the capture of rich information in the form of metadata that can then be tracked and reported upon and integrated with external systems. There are other contract management solutions also that offer that. Now, what Avenir does, in addition to our contract management solution, Avenir offers obligation management. We call it obligation flow. And what obligation flow does, and we'll get into a double click of that, what obligation flow does is it it ingests agreements or looks up agreements and associated documents that or attachments that go along with the agreement, and automatically discovers obligations for you. It automatically extracts clauses and obligations. These obligations can be actionable obligations or non-actionable obligations as well, i.e., obligations that could become actionable in the future. For example, hey, if there is a breach, security breach, then something needs to be done. That would be a non-actionable obligation. So Avenir's obligation solution actually goes and automatically discovers those obligations and then helps with assigning and fulfillment and monitoring of those obligations as well. Now, Avenir's obligation management solution, Obligation Flow, works in conjunction with our own contract management solution. But in addition to that, it works with any other contract management solution or even a repository that you may have in place. So that's really awesome about Avenir's obligation management solution. Of course, having both contract management and obligation management, i.e., obligation discovery, um, fulfillment, and monitoring, tracking of that on the same platform has its benefits as well. There's a slightly lesser burden of integration. Yep. We can move on to the next slide. Yeah. Okay, and here, we wanted to double click into our obligation flow built on the ServiceNow platform. And using AI technology that includes NLP and machine learning, what Avenir Obligation Flow does, like I mentioned, is it actually ingests agreements. You can import agreements, any type of agreement, or of coming from any platform, and any associated appendices and attachments that go with the agreement. And then the engine actually, Avenir's obligation engine, actually AI enabled obligation engine, actually goes and extracts out all of those obligations, and then automatically creates tasks associated with those obligations, i.e., fulfillment tasks that can then be routed to different groups, different departments, like we talked about. Some can go to legal, some can go to IT for actually going and measuring SaaS specific service level agreements, and so on and so forth. And then of course, the compliance against those obligations can also be tracked, can be approved, and then reported back again for a holistic view of performance, whether it's your performance or the vendor's performance. Yeah. And with that, I mean, we can move on to the next slide. I would love to hand it over to
Hey, Sunil, real quick,
yes, yes,
I
yeah,
do see a question
yes,
in
absolutely.
the chat box. Can your AI engine extract complex metadata, i.e., uptime, percent, penalty, and period complexity, and submit a report every quarter showing monthly uptime percent and days when uptime fell below 99%?
Yes, absolutely. So that is the beauty of the engine. So we don't just extract the obligation, and you'll see that in the demo. We don't just extract the obligation as text. Embedded in that obligation language would be metadata. Exactly, metadata. There would be frequency. Every quarter something needs to be measured. There would be an uptime, for example, an uptime percentage, minimal uptime requirement specified as a percentage. So we absolutely definitely extract all of that rich metadata as well. And metadata can get pretty hairy and structured, but the engine is really smart. It does that, and we'll show that to you in the demo as well. Yep. Thanks for that question, Jason. With that, Rohit, I'll hand it over to you to wow us with the demonstration of Avenir obligation flow on ServiceNow.
Awesome. So thank you, Sunil, for handing it over, and thank you, Sunil and Jason, for this awesome discussion about what obligations and how risky the contracts are. So you rightly pointed out that every contract is kind of complex, and there's a lot of intricacies that is there within the contract, right? You have multiple risks in form of obligations, and during the execution itself, there is a lot of things that needs to be done. So you need to obviously identify the obligations and try to also reach out to the stakeholders. So that's a workflow in itself, so which you need to take care of. And contract managers most of the times have to go to each stakeholder and say, okay, where is the task? Have you fulfilled the task or not? And that's a huge that back and forth between the stakeholders. It takes a lot of time of the contract managers, and that's what we're trying to fulfill or solve with obligation flow in here. So if we talk about the contract manager, so they first have to identify the contracts and then try to identify the different SLAs and obligations that's probably lying within the contract. Now, a typical SaaS contract that you earlier mentioned, they're pretty risky, and those are like long 30, 40 pages, 50 pages of contract. And most of those contracts or SaaS contracts specifically are part of suppliers, right? Those are the contract languages of supplier. So each contract manager has to review those 30, 40 pages every time. And that's what we're trying to solve with obligation flow. And that's what we're going to also talk about a bit more in the demo. So before we get into the demo, that how we are solving with each contract, how we're extracting the data. Uh, the first thing that a contract manager, when they logs in into the obligation flow, the dashboard or the solution, they just see that okay, they will go back and see what are the typical obligations they are assigned to, because each manager is assigned like 100 contracts, right? So they have 1,000 or maybe at least 200 of obligations, tasks that they have to fulfill. So the first priority for them is to resolve those tasks really fast, because that's how you become more effective in solving or managing the risk on that one. So as a contract manager, you're going to track the contract, you will track the SLAs, and then you'll try to follow up on the fulfillment task that's there. And that's what is also available on the dashboard. Now, what you're seeing on the left-hand side are the typical obligations that get assigned to a vendor, to a contract manager called Melissa. So I've logged in as Melissa, and she just sees, okay, what is the typical obligation that she has to manage. She is currently managing all the SaaS contract. That means all the clauses or the SLAs specific to categories like data protection or SLAs. Those are the typical obligation that she kind of solves out there. Interestingly, discovering obligations is the first part. The second phase is about assigning the task to different owners, right? So on the right hand side, you're seeing all the tasks that get assigned to specific stakeholders or to the different owners. Uh, so any task that goes on moves across different stages within the journey, right? Where it starts with the pending, where you start assigning the task to each owner. So you have a list of stakeholders or owners who are assigned all the different tasks that's underlying within the contract, right? So you would, as a contract manager, you would like to move it from pending to work in progress and finally fulfill the task. And as a contract manager, your nirvana is that all the pending tasks will move over to the closed task, right? That's the nirvana. Nobody wants to see the pending task. And this is where there's a lot of back and forth that can be managed or automated by the system itself via notifications or via reminders. So far I'm just talking about the dashboard and the outcome of how a contract manager can manage the obligations or probably manage the task. So how do they achieve or understand what are the different underlying obligations within a typical contract? Now, if you see a typical SaaS contract, all those contracts are like third party contracts, right? Where all this those are not part of your contract templates, your organization contract templates. Those contract papers come in the contract language of a supplier or a vendor, or your typical IT vendor, where all the different SLAs of uptime, renewals, pricing, what kind of the return time, everything is being mentioned. And those are typically in a Word document. So when a contract manager receives those kind of contracts, they will come in and try to upload those third party papers or all those typical SaaS contracts. So as a contract manager, I'm going to upload the contract and then see how I can identify the different obligations on there. So as a contract manager, I'm just going in and seeing, okay, this was the latest contract that I've received. So I'm just going to upload the contract and then try to create a contract out of it, and then finally create the obligations and the related task behind it. uh, Typical contract size again is going to be 40 to 50 pages. So system is going to analyze the contract and as a first step identify what could be the possible contract metadata. So system has kind of identified, okay, this is the contract, contract summary. Okay, this should be a possibly master service agreement. What kind of list or what kind of contract model it could be, the template type, uh, contract start date, contract terms. So all those are the typical things that we got it from the contract. So as a next step, I'm just going to click on creating the contract, and system is now going to generate the contract document within the system. It's going to create a record out there. Now, why this is critical? Because you're getting step by step of first understanding the contract also. So as the first step of onboarding the contract, I just go in and say, okay, this is a SaaS contract. I got the vendor already as a Creative Labs, and okay, already it is mentioned that the payment type is going to be monthly, and after this, I'm just going to save it. Once I save it, the contract is going to come over as a, the all the complete data is going to fill out here. So I'm going to give some time to the system so that they extract or create the proper contract format that can be easily reused later on.
Yep. So, Rohit, what you're showing is that if the contract exists even in an external system, it can just be ingested and that contract record can be created here, and then you can do the obligation discovery. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yep.
Uh, so we have onboarded a different contract, an external contract, and now we are going to create a contract document. And as a next step, we'll create the different or discover the different obligations in the contract. Everything is happening in the real time, so that's why you're seeing the system is going and trying to identify the different data around it. Okay. So now this is the specific contract related data that needs to be done. Like you have a system generated number, and that based on the numbering that the you have put in the system, that it has been configured in the system, and you can see the Word document that was attached, and also you can see the actual contract that was there. So you have this typical contract, and it's a very long contract, and normally in a real world without any solution to help, uh, the contract manager is going to go through each of the page and try to identify what are the different obligations within the contract. So we are going to take a shortcut and say, okay, if I already have obligation flow, so I'll just go in and start discovering the obligations from that 30-40 page contract that came in. uh, And as an outcome, normally what we have seen is that those SaaS contract, for example, the first phase is auto discovering the contract or auto discovering the obligations. And as Sunil and Jason earlier discussed, that the contract needs a deeper look. That means your AI and obligation is going to first understand what the contract is all about. When you say it categorize, okay, that it's a SaaS contract, it's a service level contract. So what can be specific obligations that's going to be there? Then it's going to break it down into that is it an actionable obligation or non-actionable obligations, and then it's going to start identify what category of obligation is going to be there, and then based on that it's going to start fulfilling, start creating different tasks around it.
Yep. You can see um, the application spinning, and it's trying to actually read through and interpret and pull out those obligations. For the purpose of this demonstration, we wanted to do this real time. Of course, if you have large volumes of agreements, and then, you could also have run all of this in batch mode while you're not, so that you're not waiting, but at least the system would go and identify all the obligations. And here, if you think about it, we made you wait for about a minute, maybe or less, and that's far less than someone having to go and pore over every single line and word in a 50-page document and to try to really extract and interpret language, whether it's an obligation or not. So compared to that, we are hoping that you would be accommodating and forgiving of this 1 minute wait here.
Yeah.
Rohit,
And
back to you.
yeah,
Yeah.
and earlier Sunil was talking with one of our experts, earlier in the day, and the expert was saying, okay, normally I take 2 to 3 hours to just go through the contract and identify the obligations. So
Yep.
this is faster than what we thought.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, by the way, Rohit, there was a question also that came up in the audience. I think you've already answered it through the demonstration. Yeah, I just saw the question now. It came about 10, 12 minutes ago. How effective is your AI in extracting contract clauses and library? So I think you've already shown that, the contract clause extraction, you've already shown through the ingestion process, and then the obligation discover obligations actually goes and once again reads through all of those clauses to actually identify those needles in the haystack. Yeah.
Yeah. So the right hand side is the answer to your question.
Yep.
The obligations basically get extracted on its own, and this is how powerful it is. Where it's one start identifying what the obligation is going to be about, and then it also start kind of based on the data model or the training that it had earlier. It also start assigning priority, that which kind of obligation has to be prioritized, which should be high priority, which should be medium priority. So that kind of options assignment is normally done based on the earlier training of the contract or via the AI. And also, when a specific obligation is identified, there are also typical fields or a typical task that needs to be created. For example, when an obligation is discovered, it also needs to be assigned to someone who is going to take an action. So, in the obligation flow terminology, it's known as a responsible person. In this case, Abraham Lincoln is supposed to fulfill the task, is supposed to complete the task. Now, if the task is completed or not, it needs to be verified by someone. So the person is going to be accountable for the completion of task, and the person assigned for this obligation is Melissa, who is going to verify, okay, that whether this task has been fulfilled or not. So there is different kind of nuances that's there. You would also like to see, okay, who is going to be ownership, who is going to hold the ownership for this particular obligation or the task, right? Because in typical SaaS contracts, you would like to see, okay, is the vendor going to take an action or is it going to be the company, right? So you would like to assign the ownership also, that okay, should I be taking the action or not? So that kind of segregation is also needed for all the actionable kind of obligations. uh, Importantly, any obligation also need to be categorized. Okay, so if you want to get a holistic view, okay, what are the specific categories that I received? Is it an audit based or is it any level based? So I can go and check that what kind of obligations are normally getting extracted. So once I've verified the specific all the the details that came in, I just try to save it and say, okay, it's a worthy enough obligation to be added. And then this is you can basically give assign a record or assign it saying that okay, this obligation needs to be attached to the contract. Uh, in case of contract, you might get 50 or 100 kind of obligations or different tasks that needs to be done, but not all obligations are created equally or are equally important. So you would like to choose maybe three essential obligations, and the remaining one obligation you can just ignore, because you don't want to overwhelm all the stakeholders with all the different tasks, right? You want them to focus only on the critical obligations. So as a contract manager, you have that choice of which kind of obligation needs to be prioritized to get processed. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of probably process two specific obligations and say okay, others are not relevant for me, so let me just ignore it. So I'm just going to click on refresh and see okay, which are the relevant obligations, only those will be attached. So in this case, only two contract obligations are important for me. So let me deep dive even further and see okay, what happens within the obligations, right? So I'll just go back and check that in the specific obligations, what kind of task also needs to be attached. So is there any task that I've attached to it or not? So I can also go back and check that part. One thing which I really kind of also missed out earlier was it's really also important to see what's the frequency of setting up the obligations. Do you want to go back and check in each obligation once in just one time as an ad hoc basis, or you just want to assign it weekly, monthly, annually? Most obligations typically we have seen is in the monthly or an quarterly part of it. So accordingly, the task will be created every time. Uh, that's one of the things. And as let me just go back to the task dashboard and see what exactly happens. So choosing on the specific task that has been created, uh, you can also go back and see okay, in the task level, what are the different things I need to do. For example, even if the task has been created, you also need to go and check whether the owner has been notified, whether the task is complete or not. So you can set up different actions so that none of the tasks remain pending status. So it moves over, and your SLAs or the obligations are properly managed. Because as a contract manager, it's just not about discovering the obligation. As the second phase, like assignment of obligations, as the third phase, fulfillment of obligations is also part of my KPI. So I'd like to ensure that also to be done. uh, there are two ways to do it. Either you can manually go back and notify, or you can set up different reminders that the specific task owner needs to check in every maybe every 15 days or every 30 days until the task is completed. So those kind of different notifications, automation is possible there. So this is what we do. Yeah, and this is what we do currently at the task level. Now let's go back at the 35,000 feet level and see what happens even if the task has been created. So what's the big deal around that? So now I'll go back and have a zoom out and check what are the different obligations that normally gets created from the contract. So I can go back and see okay, what are the typical obligations that's created. It's SLA. And this is what we also mentioned in the survey, that most common type of obligations are SLAs or different renewals that's coming in. So as an organization, you can also zoom out and see and have a holistic perspective of what the different obligations. Uh, the final part of the demo is about the monitoring part. How do you ensure that all the tasks or all the obligations are properly in the specific category? And for specific categories, you might have to also prioritize. So you can see okay, at for example, as an organization, I would like audit specific obligations to be fulfilled faster. So I can always go back and check at each contract level or vendor level how do I ensure that the tasks are fulfilled faster? So this way I can zoom in and zoom out at task level or at the organization level. And I just see we have 5 minutes left, so let me stop the demo here and wait for questions.
Yep. Hey, Rohit, thank you so much. I mean, I'm sure our audience is super smart. They get it, as long as the ability to really, the heavy lifting is in the AI engine to really extract clauses, to identify obligations, and then there is the whole workflow management capability that you showed, i.e., creation of the tasks and assigning those tasks. And then, once that all of that is captured, then creating these dashboards and providing that visibility across the board, that becomes really easy because all the data is captured, the monitoring is captured. um, so yep, in the interest of time, we can move on. I mean, there are barely 5 minutes left. There is another, well, there are two questions popped up actually. How many contracts have you managed till date? I don't know the answer to that. However, I know that we have large enterprise grade customers, that have actually used this for ingesting and discovering obligations across, like, I think 6 to 7 thousand agreements. So that is a pretty significant number. The other question that came up is, what is the overall implementation cycle time? um, you know if you only had one contract template type and no legacy, and you didn't have thousands and thousands of legacy agreements, I would say this is a ready to use system. You can get up and running in pretty much no time. But, practically, there would be, your contract types, your categories that would need to be configured, access roles, permissions, templates. So it could take anywhere from about 2 weeks to 12 weeks, the implementation cycle time, which in my mind is something unique that Avenir offers, i.e., the actual time to value. Um, so, yep, those were some of the questions. Okay, one more came up. How are pre-awarded contracts managed? So I think this refers to agreements that have that already exist. These could be legacy agreements or agreements coming from an external system. I think we've already shown that in the demo as well, that we have the ability to integrate or ingest agreements originating from any other system. um, Jason, you've been amazing, but I think this might have been the first time that you saw what a double click into our solution. We'd love to hear a couple of words from you on what you saw.
Yeah, it's great. I think this is one of those areas that's often ignored, and I say ignored, not truly ignored, but sort of bypassed in the larger conversation of sort of the trend of contract management lately. Everybody's focused on that, like I said, the pre-execution phase of things. So looking at
Yeah.
this tool, I mean, being able to dig into the contract and just extract single data points, I mean, that's been done. Being able to distill and discern certain areas, it's sort of like an attorney doing issue spotting, being able to actually parse the natural language and understand sort of complex ideas and concepts in that contract. I mean, that's pretty special. So I look forward to seeing what you guys do, and sort of to some of these questions here, on a larger scale as well. And I think you said that the tool itself can be integrated with these other systems. It's not necessarily a replacement if somebody's got their CLM system. This is something that can add on to it. And I
Absolutely.
think that's great.
Yep, absolutely. And actually, there was a question there right about integration. What is the integration flexibility? Because we are using other contract management systems. So Avenir Obligation Flow is built on the ServiceNow platform, and ServiceNow offers an integration hub with spokes, i.e., specialized connectors. Actually, they have specialized connectors to ERPs, to SAP, to CRMs like Salesforce. So, yes, absolutely. We can connect to any existing contract management system that you might have.
And I will say, having been down this road of demos in previous lives with contract management systems and sat on thousands of system demos. I applaud you guys for even taking the attempt to do something like this live in a presentation to show the tool, because a million things can go wrong and hiccup. And I do think it's important to underscore the fact that even though it took a minute or two, and as you're talking through it, the thing is spinning, what it was doing to that contract, it cannot be understated how long that takes from a manual process. And so I think when people take a step back, maybe they were sitting here going, okay, it's spinning, it's spinning, it's spinning. But they take a step back and think, okay, this could have taken me an hour, could have taken me 2 hours in my typical life. And they're going to go back to their contract process today, and they're going to see how long it takes. I applaud you guys for taking that risk and jumping out there and doing that, and then seeing it come back and work. Is always sort of that,
Yep.
cherry on top.
Yep. Thank you, Jason. And to be fair, to be honest, I don't believe anyone else is doing this in an intelligent manner. And we are still learning from our customers. But what our customers have reported so far, the accuracy levels that they have reported, they are way more than what we had even thought that we could deliver. So we are ourselves pleasantly surprised at the accuracy level of what we have been able to deliver in terms of obligation discovery. Yep. So we are pretty much at the top of the hour now, and with that, I wanted to thank everyone for their patience, for hearing us out and taking a deeper look at Avenir's obligation flow capabilities. I wanted to thank Jason. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure interacting with you, and I always learn something new when I speak with you. So thank you for that. Rohit, thank you for the great demonstration of Avenir obligation flow. Folks, our contact information is available out here. Please feel free to get in touch if you need to do a no-cost maturity assessment or want to learn more about our products. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
For the invite.
Thank you so much, Ross, Jason.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Sunil.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.